All right, welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 3. We've come to the second major section in our instruction in godly justice. That first one was Romans chapter 12, verses 17 to 21. And now, if you look at your note takers, let's fill in that next part. And that's going to be section 2 is Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And this is going to switch now from personal justice to governmental justice. And just to get ourselves started, let's take a look at these 7 verses that we're going to be studying together, and let's just read through them. So here we go, Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So in these first 7 verses of Romans chapter 13, Paul is going to be talking about our responsibility toward human government, what God expects of us, and this is probably going to be some of the most difficult lessons that we will go through just because of the culture that we're presently living in. Considering that, some of these instructions are going to be things that you're going to look at, and they're not going to be the knee-jerk thing or the natural thing to do. But I think they're important if we're going to be the godly people that God intends for us to be. So let's take a look at this first verse alone, and let's make a couple of observations about this. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Now, this is for everybody, and there aren't any exceptions here. The every soul, I believe, refers to whether you're saved or whether you're lost, you're part of a local assembly or you're not, it doesn't matter. If you're alive, then God is calling you to be obedient to verse 1 of chapter 13. Now, just remember, when Paul writes this, remember the political climate that he's living in when he writes this in Romans. Rome is the seat of government throughout much of the civilized world. And so Paul is actually, of course, going to wind up over there in Rome. And I want to talk to you about the disposition of the Roman government as Paul is writing back in his day. Now, if you'll look at that note taker, some of you have it on page, I think, 27. Some of you have it on, 26 or something. I think it's somewhere along in there. It accidentally got put over into session 8. But we're going to fill that out today, and I'm doing it on the board because on the PowerPoint slide, there was too much information and the writing becomes too small for everybody to see. So I'm just going to plug it in on the board behind me here. And so, and just remember what we're doing here. This is not a history lesson. I want you to get a context for what it would be like in the years leading up to the time that Paul is conducting his ministry and eventually goes to Rome himself. And when he writes the book of Romans, he is giving us instruction about how to respond to the government. And so we're going to kind of be filling this out. So in the first 70 years of the first century following the birth of Christ, and you can see on that chart, may got cut off on yours, I'm not sure, but this arrow right here represents the birth of Christ. And on the current timeline, Jesus actually gets born in 4 BC. Now, I know that sounds crazy. I mean, he actually does get born when he gets born. But on this timeline, that actually works out. If you're going to be accurate, it works out to 4 BC. But during the first 70 years of the first century following the birth of Christ, you have 5 Roman emperors. I want us to very quickly run through them, and you get an idea of who they were and what they were about, so you'll understand the kind of government that Paul was living under and actually writing about here in Romans chapter 13. The first one is Augustus. So that's who you should fill in that first square there. He is already the Roman emperor when Jesus is born into the world. We see him mentioned in the gospel accounts in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1. Let me give that to you. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Now, lots of places at Christmas time, they read this Luke 2 because it's talking about that event. And Caesar Augustus is the guy who is the ruler of everything when Jesus is born into the world. The next one is Tiberius. Tiberius is that second Roman ruler in this first century. He is also mentioned in the Bible. We're going to read this in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. And Luke 3 says that John the Baptist began his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. Now, how long after the birth of Christ is it until John the Baptist shows up? It's about, I mean, he's born the year before, 6 months before, but it's about 30 years. He starts his ministry when he's 30. So that means that Tiberius comes to be the Caesar when John the Baptist is about 15 years old. But let's just read the thing in Luke. So here it is. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Ituraea, and of the region of Trachonitis, and Licinius, the tetrarch of Abilene, that's here in Texas, Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest, the word of God came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. That's John the Baptist. So that's in the 15th year. Now, after Tiberius comes 4 very, very difficult years under the third emperor, and that is Caligula. This guy, just to give you a little bit about this, and I've given it to you in your notes, he had an altar made to himself. By the way, listen, this is not super unusual. When we get into the book of Corinthians, what you're going to find out is that there was an emperor and some members of the royal family. There was a cult that worshiped them as gods. And in certain places, like Corinth, that was a very important part of the culture of that city-state. And so this guy, he kind of gets the ball rolling. He gets an altar made to himself. He also has a temple made for himself. He ordered all the statues of the gods. Now, there's a lot of gods in Rome. He orders all the statues that are across Rome to be brought to Rome. I said all across Rome, actually all across the Roman Empire. He orders those statues to be brought at Rome. He has all their heads removed and replaced with heads that look like his. So all the gods now look like Caligula. He has a statue made of himself. And every day, whatever he was wearing, that statue got changed to match him exactly. So, if he was wearing a purple shirt and gray slacks and a tie, then that's what the statue would be. Well, of course, he doesn't wear that, but the statue is going to be dressed just like him. So every day, when you saw the statue in the plaza, you would know exactly what the emperor was wearing that day. And if he changed, the statue had to be changed. He was a very immoral man. He didn't have much of a filter about his actions. And after 4 years, 2 of his bodyguards assassinate him, and the whole empire breathed a sigh of relief. And so that was Caligula. The 4th emperor in this century is a guy named Claudius. He's referred to in Acts chapter 18 and verse 2. I'm going to read that, but let me give you a little bit of a background. In Rome, there were a lot of Jewish people, but you had a number of Jewish people who had believed in Jesus as the Christ. But then you also had a bunch of Jewish people that had rejected Jesus as the Christ. There was a lot of tension between these groups. In fact, so much so that when Claudius, is having to deal with this Hebrew issue so much, he finally just passed an edict and said, all the Jews are leaving Italy. Get out. So he kicked them all out. So there was a diaspora, so to speak. There was a leaving of all those Jews. Let's take a look at the passage in Acts. And that's just the rest of the John the Baptist. But Acts 18:1. And after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. So we'll talk about that verse more when we get over into Corinthians. But what's happening is Claudius has kicked all the Jews out. These folks wind up, if you know what that's like, if you know what the map looks like, it makes perfect sense. They just sailed, went from Rome, they went to the coast, they sailed out of Italy. Corinth is right there at Achaia. It's a pretty close port, and so naturally that's where all that was taking place. The 5th emperor, and this is the guy, is Nero. Nero rules for 14 years until he commits suicide at the age of 32. So he's young. Here's some interesting things about Nero, and I'm going to bring them up here because later when we get into Corinthians, there's a couple of things that we will allude to that'll bring you back to this. Nero fancied himself as a singer, and he loved applause. So often in the Senate, he would have singing competitions, and he would enter the singing competition. Guess who always won? Nero. Always. Now, I think he self-deluded himself into thinking that he was legitimately the best. And so the historians of the day record these kinds of events. So he'd have these singing competitions. There was an open-air auditorium there in Rome, and so what he would do is he would have everybody come in to hear him, and he would put on a concert, long concert, singing and singing and singing. When they came in, they actually locked the gates. We kidded about that earlier when we were, we locked the doors so nobody leaves because, they locked the gates. People were so desperate to get out that they faked their death so that people could carry them out to their funeral and escape out of the concert that Nero was giving. So, it was pretty... And really, when you read the history of this, these people get really inventive about ways to be able to get out of there. In fact, they're planning when they get there. They've already got things set up, so that, they can find a way to get out of there. And, of course, you had to clap and clap and clap forever to make sure that Nero knew that he was appreciated. People snuck over the walls. They did all kinds of things. They were bringing ways to be able to do that. Nero was also a very cruel man. He murdered his first wife. He murdered his own aunt. He tried to poison his mother on 3 separate occasions. So I guess he didn't like her. Fortunately, every time he poisoned her, she found an antidote before the poison killed her. So it wasn't like she avoided the poison. She got poisoned and then realized what was happening and found an antidote. He tried to talk a ship's captain into sinking. His mother was taking a trip. He tried to talk a ship's captain into sinking his ship at sea so his mother would drown. Well, that one didn't work. He hired a carpenter to come in and weaken the roof above her bed so that when she slept at night, the roof might fall in on her and kill her. But that one didn't work out either. That failed. Over the course of his 15 years, he married 3 women and 2 men. This is a hard thing to talk about. In fact, I'm not going to. If you're interested in the history of all of that with Nero, let me just say it like this. Every debaucherous thing that Nero did was in your face. He didn't just do it in private. All of this was done very publicly. And of course, to the chagrin of people with any morals or ethics whatsoever. I gave you some things in the notes about that. You can read that on your own. Suetonius is a historian of the day. He's not a Christian. He's one of 2 primary historians, Roman historians, who were writing during the reign of Nero. I'm going to quote from his history. Here it is. The whole of his, talking about Nero's life, was one continued scene of lewdness, sensuality, cruelty, and folly. That's what's happening. By the way, Nero is the guy who is emperor when Paul is put to death. And so that's what's happening in Rome just after the 1st century. So when Paul's writing the book of Romans, it's not a good scene. Augustus, remember, he's trying to find out where he's putting all the babies to death. Oh, he's a wonderful guy. All of these guys that you're looking at, Caligula, he can only last 4 years before he gets assassinated. He is so bad. So now we've got these guys filled in across there, and you get an idea of those 5 emperors. The next thing that I'd like for us to look at is in Acts 25, Paul has been arrested, and he knows he's not going to get a fair trial there, but because he's a Roman citizen, he has the right to appeal to Caesar. And so that is what he is going to do. He's going to make an appeal to Caesar. So that means he's going to have to travel to Rome. He's going to be taken to Rome as a prisoner, and he's going to wait until he can be heard. And as Paul does this, he's not really hindered from preaching the gospel. And I think Paul believes that he's going to be found innocent and he's going to continue his ministry. So he goes to Rome, and he just believed that's the way he's going to do that. Now look, let me give you this. The events, so in the book of Acts, you have the record of all these things that are happening to Paul all the way up to chapter 28 when Paul is arrested. So this block right here, this, from right here, just after 30 AD, the events of the book of Acts. That's what goes in that. The events of the book of Acts. And so Paul, like I said, in Acts 25, he's arrested. He knows he's not going to get a fair trial. Everything is stacked against him. So off to Rome he goes so he can appeal to Caesar. Paul writes Romans around 57 AD. Somewhere around there. By the way, does anybody know where Paul is when he writes Romans? He's in Corinth. I'm not sure what just fell off. Oh. All right. So he's writing from Corinth. We'll talk about that again when we get over into Corinthians. And so here's what's happening. From this part right here until here, this is Paul in Rome. Yes. Hang on, maybe we'll come to it. It may be in session 9. I'm not really sure. Okay, we'll see. Just hang on and let me see if we come to that. Okay. So Paul is in Rome, and then of course he gets executed before 70 AD, but not long before 70 AD. Now the point that I'm trying to make here is between the time that Paul goes to appeal to Caesar and the actual time that his case gets heard, the attitude toward Christianity has changed in Rome, and not for the better. Now it's getting worse for Christians. The system of justice in Rome had pretty much collapsed, and Christians, under Nero, Christians were being thrown to the lions in the circus. And also we know that Nero, he had this ambition to do some things with Rome. He actually had the city burned so it could be rebuilt the way he wanted to rebuild it. And so, but you know what? Everybody's in such uproar about so much of the city being burned up that he blamed it on the Christians. And as a result, Christians were charged with crime of arson and put to death. But the interesting thing about this is the majority of the Christians who were charged were not charged with arson. The charge was cruelty against humanity. But the thing they were being tried for was evidently they set the city on fire. So they charged them on crimes against the human race, and so there was. This is written by another historian of the day, Tacitus. He was not a believer in Jesus Christ, and he was not a defender of Christianity, but he wrote the truth about Christians being falsely charged and trumped up accusations against them, and them being put to death as a result of being found guilty. Now, why am I telling you about all of this? Because I want you to get a sense for what it is like to be living at the time that Paul is writing Romans chapter 13. So there's an application to be made. If we think we are being persecuted today, and really and truly in America, there's not a whole lot of persecution going on. There are some groups around the world that keep track of that. And I actually have a magazine that gets sent to my house every month that talks about the worst places in the world where persecution is going on. We don't experience anything like that here. But if we thought that we were having some kind of persecution going here, let me just say that we don't experience anything like the kind of persecution that was going on for Christians during the lifetime of the Apostle Paul, and especially under the rulership of Nero. So how was Paul you understand what I'm doing here, right? I'm trying to show you that when Paul was writing to the members of the body of Christ, in the midst of Christianity being increasingly rejected and it getting worse and worse for Christians, here is the inspired scripture of how God would want His believers to respond to this. That's why this is so important for us to understand. These are the people that lived under Caligula and under Claudius and under Nero. People are being put to death on trumped-up charges. And so what does Paul say? Can I take you back just in your memory to the Justice Part 1? So I'm just going to give you kind of a panorama of that. Here's what God is saying about that. He's saying, don't render evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. As much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Do not avenge yourselves. Conduct ministry toward your enemy. Don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. And now in chapter 13, he's telling you, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Because in this day, plenty of people don't want to be subject to the higher powers because the powers aren't doing what they want them to do. Or even maybe what the powers aren't doing what they ought to do. But Paul is not giving you this series of loopholes about be subject to the higher powers as long as they're doing the right thing, or be subject to the higher powers as long as they're acting like Christians, or be subject to the higher powers as long as they're not He's not doing any of that. He is already saying, yes, this is going to be happening to you, and you're not going to like it, and here's the way I want you to respond to it. I know what it's like in this country, and I know what people stand on the soapbox and get all worked up about. I do, because I've been there. I've been part of that. I do. We look at things, and even though we're better off than many places in the world, we can look and see what our liberties and our freedoms that are kind of being chipped away at constantly, so that more and more of our lives is being regulated. There's all kinds of groups that would love to purge Christianity out of the country. Folks, that was going on during the time that Paul was writing. Here's the difference. You're not having your head chopped off because you're a Christian. They were. They were. And yet Paul is saying, be subject unto the higher powers. Now, we can say, no, we're not having our heads chopped off yet. But folks, the emphasis is on the word not. You are not. And you say, maybe one day it will be yet, but you're living in the not in the yet. Okay? I mean, one day you'll have a glorified body, but not yet. So I'm just saying, this is about how we live in that particular atmosphere. Now, it may get that bad for us in this country in our lifetime. It may not in our lifetime. Either way, the instruction that Paul is giving us still stands. You say, but things are getting worse and worse. I just demonstrated to you how that was happening exactly in Paul's day, and he wasn't going, it's getting worse and worse. He just said, bless them that persecute you. Don't be overcome with evil. Overcome evil with good. And now let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. What is God doing by having his apostle write this? And people say, well, it's just getting worse and worse. Only in some ways, but not in every way. So what I'd like to do is kind of put that argument to bed for a minute, because people say, oh, okay, it was bad back then, but it is worse now. Well, that depends on what you're talking about. So let me take you through this PowerPoint. The first slide that I'm going to show you here, wow, I hope you can see that. I don't know if that came out good enough. I guess it did. First slide that I'm going to show you here is poverty. Now let me talk about what is defined as extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is living on less than $1.90 per day based on 2011 dollars. Now what we've done is we've adjusted now for the differences and for inflation among countries, and we adjusted for countries that have a non-monetary income. We see all of that. And so 200 years ago, you know what you have? 200 years ago, you have 90% of the world's population living on less than $1.90 per day. 90%. You know what that means? There's not much middle class. You have a few people that are very wealthy, and then you've got the big portion of the world that is, just extremely poor. I mean, can you imagine today living on $1.90 a day? I mean, that wouldn't even be $60 a month. I mean, that's just crazy. So now in 2015, now that's 2015. That's the only numbers I could really get close to this on. You can see that the numbers have almost reversed. Now, that has gone from 90% of the world's population to about 10% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty. Let's talk about literacy, the ability to read and write. 200 years ago, 1 out of every 10 people could read and write. And I'm talking about at 15 years of age. So think of a 15-year-old or older, only 1 in 10 could read or write. That has almost in the last 200 years completely reversed itself to where now almost 90% of the world's population can read and write. I'm not talking about America. I'm talking about the whole world. Almost 90% now can read or write. So I'm just going to ask this question. So let me back up. So when we're talking about poverty, is the world gotten better or worse? Well, it's gotten better. If you're talking about literacy, has the world gotten better or worse in the last 200 years? It's gotten better. If you're talking about now child mortality, this is an important one. When we're talking about child mortality, we're talking about kids 5 years of age or younger. Do you know what the death rate was for children in the first 5 years of their life 200 years ago? 200 years ago, the death rate for kids 5 and under was 40%. 40%. People think because they see the average lifespan back then and they see the average lifespan today and they say, people are living longer than ever. No, they're not. You know what happened? We found out that there were waterborne illnesses that were killing kids when they were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. We were losing 40% of our children because we didn't realize there were bacteria in water that was giving them infections and killing them. So you know what that was doing is bringing the average lifespan way down. When we all of a sudden figured that out and cleaned up the water sources, the average went up, but it didn't go up because people are living so much longer. It went up because we quit losing 40% of our kids before the age of 5. So if you look at that, and by the way, and what is it now? I mean, before it was 40%, and you know what it is now in the world? Less than 2%. So let me ask you, in the last 200 years, has child mortality gotten better or worse? See, it's gotten better. See, people make a general statement. They go, it's just getting worse and worse. And we say that here. It's just getting worse and worse. I don't know how many of your friends had their heads cut off for being a Christian. How many of you got thrown into jail because people found out you were a follower of Jesus Christ? Yeah, that didn't happen to me, and I don't keep that a secret. So I'm just giving you some things about this that we say these things because we think they're true. We don't realize what it was like before. So let me give you the next one here. Let's talk about the different kind of governments in the world. Because we have an idea about some kind of governments that they're bad and other kinds of governments are better. And so I've given you a graph there. So here's what we have. Now, 200 years ago, for 10% of the countries in the world, we didn't have any data whatsoever. So now what I'm about to give you on a breakdown is for the remaining 90% of countries that are in the world 200 years ago. So 200 years ago, the number of people that lived in a colony was about 38%. Now, what am I saying when I say they lived in a colony? Listen to this carefully. We'll cover this again in Corinthians. In 146 BC, the Roman Empire was really beginning to spread across the world. In Greece, Corinth, and some other of those big cities, there were city-states. In other words, kind of had their own governments going. They decided they were going to band together and resist the conquering of Rome that Rome was doing. Corinth decided to do that. Now you have to understand, at the time that happens, Corinth is one of the largest cities in the world. And the emperor in Rome decided to make an example of anybody that wanted to resist Roman conquest. And so they absolutely destroyed the city of Corinth in 146 BC. It lay empty and just practically deserted except for a few nomads that just lived in ruins or little shelters that they just kind of threw up around there for over 100 years. And then in 44 AD, I'm sorry, in 44 BC, I'm sorry, not AD, 44 BC, the Roman emperor said, by the way, you say, who was that? Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar says, let's rebuild Corinth and make it a Roman colony. Now, what is a colony? A colony means when you see this colony, and if it's a Roman colony, then it's like you're seeing a whole lot of what it's like in Rome. If it's a Roman colony, you're going to be seeing the way it is in Rome. By the way, this country started, we had 13 what? Colonies. You know what colonies were about? A whole lot of that was like, if you see how it is here, that's how it is back in England. In other words, governmental structures, architecture, all of those things were kind of consistent, and you kind of got that flavor. And so how much? So 200 years ago, almost 38% of the countries in the world were colonies. In other words, they were kind of under the control of some mother country, and they had all of that flavor to their culture and society. Now, how much of the world was in an autocracy? What is an autocracy? It means one person is in control, and there are really no checks and balances against that person. So what part of the world 200 years ago was in an autocracy? You could call it a dictatorship. And let me give you an example of an autocracy. North Korea. You got a guy in control of that. He does whatever he wants to do. Nobody's going to correct him. They don't dare. Why? Yeah, you'll wind up going to prison or being killed, your family along with you. So you just keep your mouth shut and you smile and you be supportive, or, you're going to pay the price. How much of the world 200 years ago was in an autocracy? Almost 46%. Just under half. So you either lived in a colony or you lived in an autocracy. Now, how about a closed autocracy? Now, what is a closed autocracy? A closed autocracy says we're going to have elections, but I'm the only one running. We see that in South America, some countries there. Yeah. Well, Russia's a little bit different. So we'll talk about them in an open autocracy. But Hugo Chavez, that's a closed autocracy. Everybody go vote. I'm the only one on the ballot, but everybody go vote. And then he can say what? Hey, the people elected me. I'm following the mandate of the people. See, keeps you from, in other words, it's saying, I'm not a dictator. People wanted me. They voted for me. Okay. But we're not fooled by that. We understand what's really happening. Now let's talk about an open autocracy. By the way, in 200 years ago, how much of the world was in a closed autocracy? About 4.5%. So most of it was just plain out dictator. But there was a few that said, yeah, we're going to have an election. I'm just the only one on the ballot. How about an open autocracy? There were none. What is that? It is going to be one guy. When he gets elected, he is going to be in control. There are no checks and balances. He's going to have absolute power, and he'll probably stay in until he gets overthrown. But there is going to be an election, and he may actually be running against someone. But you understand that is a very dangerous place to be a politician, because you might be assassinated prior to the election, but you can get on the ballot. Now, there's a couple of other things about that, and that is, in some of those countries, only the elite can be on the ballot. But then there's a public autocracy, which means anybody can be on the ballot. But, the likelihood of something happening there good is pretty slim. Okay, by the way, Russia is an example of an open autocracy. And then, how much of the population, how many countries, what percentage of countries in the world were democratic, that they were elected, and those elected officials represented the people in government? Less than 1%. Now let's look at 200 years later. So if you were in a colony 200 years ago, 38% of the countries in the world were a colony. How many today? Zero. Autocracy, dictatorship, how many? About 46%. What percentage of the world today lives under a dictatorship? About 23%. So that's gone way down. In a closed autocracy, it's moved from 4.5 to 5. In an open autocracy, it went from 0 to 10. And then in a democracy, it went from 0 to 200 years later, 55% of the countries in the world have some form of democracy. So let me ask you a question. Did it get better or did it get worse? See, it got better as far as that goes. So I'm just trying to say that when you're looking at these things, now these things have improved in the world, and it seems like, but it seems like to many people that are living today, things are getting worse and worse. Personally, I enjoy not making that trip tomorrow to Glen Rose in a horse and wagon. So I'm just saying, we look at how it is, but you have to understand how it was. When we look back, I can remember my grandma. She didn't have a washing machine. She had a wash tub and a scrub board. I can remember her out there scrubbing on that scrub board and then hanging stuff up on the line. They lived out in the country. And the first time she got a washer, it was a wringer washer. Now, you know what a wringer washer is? Gloria, are you old enough to know what a wringer washer is? And my grandma was always scared because I'd go up and spend the summer. Don't get your fingers near that wringer, Michael. Oh, it just panicked her. Please don't get near the wringer washer. Oh, I'll just die if something happens. Oh, I guess that's right. For girls, it was don't get your hair stuck in a wringer washer. Right. Oh, no, that's not good. Yeah, so, look, and so today, you know what we do today? You know what? We're not scrub boarding or wringer washer, and you know what? You throw it in there, you put the detergent in, you hit the button, you walk away. And now when it comes time to dry, I can remember as a kid my mom hanging out stuff on the line. And then she'd hand me the basket, Michael, go out and get the stuff off the line. I wanted to go do stuff kids were doing. I didn't want to go out and get stuff off the line. But I did. And you know what? And now, you know what you do? You just pick it up out of the washer, throw it in the dryer, which is sitting right beside it, hit the button, and off you go. I mean, it's pretty easy, right? Oh, my. I mean, like today, think about what we did before this session started. All the marvel of computers. Okay, so there is a downside. So people look around. This is why I chuckle. People look around the world and they go, surely Jesus is coming soon. You understand, if you were living back in Paul's day and looking at what was happening to Christians, being tied to poles and lit on fire to provide light along those roadways at night, that was happening. People having to meet in secret to be able to study the Bible together and to have some kind of Christian fellowship. Because if you got caught, the next thing you know, you and your family would be ripped apart in the Colosseum by wild beasts. We don't live in that kind of a thing. People say, oh, surely. If you were back then, you know what you'd be saying? Surely the Lord's coming soon. It can't get any worse. Well, guess what? He didn't come back then. So stop saying that. That is a very subjective way of looking at your circumstances. So to end this session up, let me just say that after the flood, God put a divine institution in place that would hinder the advancement of the satanic policy of evil. It didn't stop it, but it did hinder it from happening quite so quickly. And what is that divine institution? Human government. And so human government really has one major job. And it did do its job, by the way. And it wasn't until, after the flood, it wasn't until you get all the way back now to the early part of the book of Acts where really the world had come to a place again in which they were going to reject God. Not just Israel, but also the Gentile world. Now, if we're going to be what we're supposed to be as sons and daughters, we cannot afford to pick and choose the doctrines that we will integrate into our life. If we're going to be conformed to the image of God's Son, we're going to need them all. We've already talked about in the theodicy, the judgment seat of Christ, but believe me, the way we respond to the things that are going on in our lives, we're going to face at that judgment. This is not about, Paul's not talking about politics. He's not talking about political parties. He's not talking about any of that kind of stuff. He's talking about what God expects from His sons and daughters and what it will take to get there. And so we're going to need this instruction. We really are. So what I hope that I've done in this first session is I hope that I have given you a little bit of an idea that if you had to choose between living here and now or being a Christian back then, I have to tell you, that really separated the wheat from the chaff back then, because it cost you something. May cost you your life. May cost you the lives of your family members and loved ones. To be known as a believer in Jesus Christ was very, very dangerous. And yet Paul says about the government that is doing that, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For the powers that be are ordained of God. Now, before you go off thinking, oh, so God created communism and God created it. No, that's not what that's saying. And there's a lot of confusion about these first couple of verses in Romans 13. So starting when we continue through this in our study, we're going to sort those out so that you understand exactly what Paul is talking about here. God is not the creator of a communistic regime or an oppressive autocracy. That's not what that verse is saying. And God, by the way, is not the one responsible for putting certain individuals into office or into power. I know we think that, but He's not. And I it's part of that superstitious hang-on that we have naturally as Gentiles, and the way we used to think about the Bible, that causes us to think that. And if you're it doesn't matter if you're a conservative or a liberal, or if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or whatever else it is, you have to understand God is not manipulating the system to put a certain individual into office. You know what we're getting? What we produce. And so if you like the guy in office, don't think God put him there. He didn't. And if you don't like the person in office, don't think God put them there. He didn't. So let's start looking at this from the real way that it is, the way we're supposed to be looking at it. So I am enthusiastic about us learning this doctrine, but this is probably going to be the most difficult one because of the climate we live in. Probably going to be the most difficult one to wrap our minds around. But we need it, because it is also foundational for godly judgment that is going to follow. So if you can't get this one right, it's going to be really hard to get the next one right. Okay.